think wasn't 2008 or shortly thereafter when they re-implemented Sarbanes-Oxley?
Yeah, they got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act, of course, and then that led to the collapse in 2007, 2008, and the whole Lehman Brothers scandal and um, the stock market implosion, with the Big Short being um, you know the crowning glory of the entire mess, uh, in which we once again were the goats, the American public being the goats, of course. Um, and so then afterward, they had to revamp the entire securities market. They had to revamp the derivatives market. They had to reshuffle off a whole bunch of debt. Um, both of the major corporations ultimately wound up going bankrupt. The municipal corporations in the District of Columbia uh, entered protective bankruptcies. Uh, let's see, that you know, they restructured who was doing what. Uh, Most people don't realize this, but in the wake of the 2008 collapse, then the Federal Reserve System, the Municipal Federal Reserve System, which is a trademarked entity, right, went bankrupt. So that happened in 2009, pretty promptly after the big scandal and collapse in 2008. And so then the trademark Federal Reserve System, which was a municipal corporation, was liquidated in bankruptcy and voluntary Chapter 7 as a result of all of this funky dory stuff. And so by 2011, there was no municipal Federal Reserve System left. And the actual names of the entity that was liquidated were passed on as assets to JP Morgan and Chase. So they acquired the name, the Federal Reserve System, all caps, and they acquired the name Federal Reserve Board of Governors, all caps, and they've been operating as the municipal um, Federal Reserve, doing that function ever since. And they've been going around the world recouping assets that they thought belonged to that system to pay the debts of that system, right? Well, it turns out that a lot of the debts that they recouped were not actual property that belonged to the Federal Reserve System. It was property that belonged to Americans that should never have been in the control of or possession of the municipal Federal Reserve System. And a lot of that stuff was what was called blackboarded or taken off ledger because it was accounts that contained actual physical gold or silver or diamonds or whatever physical asset it was. They weren't trading in physical assets because these municipal corporations are obligated to trade in credit only. If you read the Constitution, you'll see that the states pay in gold and silver, and the federal contractors operate on our credit. Okay? So they were only interested in credit, credit, and more credit. And what could they do to secure more things? And what could they securitize as collateral to be able to gain more credit? They were not necessarily interested in paying off all those loans because they could simply go bankrupt and dump all of that on the public, you see. So anyway, in the wake of the 2008 debacle, all this got shifted around, and suddenly one of the major players, one of the big playing pieces in the entire system, the Municipal Federal Reserve System, is gone. Boom. And instead you have JP Morgan Chase left with this massive list of assets, most of which didn't belong to the Municipal Federal Reserve System in the first place, but they're still trying to collect on them because they received that as their part as creditors in the bankruptcy. Isn't that just lovely?
Lovely.
Anyway, then you have what's called the Global Federal Reserve. And, when we're talking about the Federal Reserve, first and foremost, we all need to know that the Federal Reserve has been always a private banking cartel, and it pre-existed the present government. So when you're talking about the Federal Reserve, you're going back almost to the very, very beginning, the 1787 Federal Republic Constitution. And then it's coming forward and becoming a greater player and a bigger presence in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s prior to Lincoln. And by the time the Civil War actually happened, the Federal Reserve was a freestanding player in its own right that was supporting the government, was loaning money to the government. And that's why Lincoln wound up working with the Federal Reserve. And how they got involved in the whole blood money trade that I described in the book Blood Money, which is a trade on our physical energy and work performances, because that's what they could actually access under the terms of the Constitution. They can only deal with our credit, not with our assets. So the trick for them was to gain as much control of our assets as possible to use as collateral for their borrowing. And then on the return side of it, they simply go bankrupt and dump all of that on us, on the presumption that they are public corporations owned by us.
But what did they do with, I forget what you called it, blackboards, the actual gold and silver and gems?
They set up an entire system, an entire computer system that had black screens, green screens, blue screens, all these different colored screens that were systems pertaining to different kinds of assets.
And did
And
those
so,
coincide with the Shiva accounts? I'm sorry, I'm trying to catch up with my thoughts here. Okay.
yeah, all of the things that were actual physical assets were blackboarded in. They were blocked. Those accounts were blocked, and they were traded upon as assets. Okay, so they were blocked, and there was this entire trading empire that was based on these assets.
And that's all illegal.
Of course, it's illegal. It's all illegal securitization. The whole thing was just complete and utter crap, but they were getting away with it. And as usual, it started out as something good. You see, one of the things that you constantly observe here is that so many of the things that are profoundly evil start out as something good and get commandeered and turned into something evil. And the same goes the other way. Something evil gets commandeered and taken over and turned into something good. But in this case, it started out with a man named John Fletcher, who saw that the quote unquote global collateral accounts were basically just sort of sitting there as large sums of gold that weren't being used for anything, right? And so the idea comes about that we could have these various trading platforms. And the idea, which heavily involved the World Bank, at least early on, was that you could, if you had an asset account which was blocked and couldn't be traded, then that could be used as an asset for the time period that it was blocked. Because, okay, well, say that you, Terry, had $100 billion worth of gold sitting in an account, and it was just sort of sitting there off ledger. It's for all intents and purposes, it's just being held there like a museum exhibit, right? It's not being used. And so you, as the account holder, could choose to trade it. And you would sign a contract that you were going to leave that $100 billion in gold in that account for a period of time. You know, maybe a year, maybe 10 years, whatever. In exchange, the system would give you back the entirety of the value, the current value of that gold as legal tender, as credit. Plus, after paying the platform and the broker, you know, maybe 10, 20%, all the rest of it would get split. So that, you know, you got anywhere from 30 to 90%, and the platform operator got an additional 10%, that sort of thing. So now suddenly, instead of trading in assets, you're trading in credit derived from those assets. And depending on how skillful you are at negotiating such things, you could be getting several times the credit, the total amount of credit, as your entire asset, and you wouldn't risk your asset at all. You're just leaving your asset in the bank for that stipulated period of time, backing the bank, and the bank is taking the credit for its use.
But the problem is you create derivative after derivative after derivative.
Right, and also the problem is that the idea behind this, which I said was initially good, was that John's intent was to create money for philanthropy. You know, it was he saw this as a way that people could, you know, essentially get some benefit off their blocked assets, and at the same time generate funding for philanthropic projects all over the world. That's why the World Bank was involved. Anyway, it was a scheme to try to find a way to fund philanthropic projects. However, it failed miserably. To my knowledge, not one single penny was ever generated by this entire platform trading industry, if you will, that actually got issued and spent for philanthropic projects. They just kept rolling it over.
Well, and it's the same problem with all of the Julius Shiva accounts and all of the money that was intended to fully fund all world governments since 1941.
Right, it's just basically been siphoned and misused, abused. You know, the bankers were doing whatever they wanted, and devil take the hindmost. There was no adequate regulatory authority imposed. And the regulatory that was imposed was self-interested, so that they were in there pushing and shoving for their particular agendas and their particular desires, and didn't really care about any kind of you know, the public was not represented, and the actual asset owners were not represented. It was more like a dogfight between dogs that were trying to chew apart the same bone. And so that even the regulatory agencies were crooked and useless. And, you know, to the extent that they managed to somewhat protect the public, it was a protection by attrition. You know, it was sometimes they kept the other dog from biting the bone, but at the same time they were holding on to it in their jaws. And it's just been an absolutely crazy system. There's been no control. The removal of the Glass-Steagall provisions was probably the final straw that mandated we would devolve into this crazy, you know, boiling mass of fighting animals. Anyway, they basically ruined everything for themselves, by fighting among each other. And in the meantime, the rest of us woke up in a in a bigger and bigger way. And then we began the whole process of actually holding them to account for what they've done and what they failed to do. So it's been a long, long road. And ironically, uh, the the people that we've entrusted to do the job of justice were among the most predatory and vicious and criminal players in the entire thing. The I guess you would call it the government of Westminster, the inner city of London, um, really, uh, they really got into the middle of things and tried to seize control of world commerce.
Well, and the Committee of 300 as well.
Right. Well, to an extent, they always had control.